Well, thank you once again for joining us. We are just coming to the end of this section of this series called Thriving in Community, where we've been focusing on joy as an essential part of growing in a thriving community.
Yep.
So this is kind of week 9 of that. And so, yeah, we're just going to jump right in there as we kind of come and make this transition to the second part of this series. So, yeah, it's been a little over a month. I guess not week 9, video 9.
Yep.
Yeah, but really, if it's on week 9, we've been well over a month.
Yeah. No, it's about a month. Yeah.
So, yeah, we've been talking about joy, and the last several weeks we've been really sharing exercises that can build our joy capacity.
Mm-hmm. And I think the reason for that is that we're understanding from the research we've been reading that our brains are actually meant to be fueled by joy.
That's right. However, it's really important because something that they note in some of their research is that it is not the only fuel.
Okay, what else can fuel our brain?
The other fuel they talk about is fear.
Oh.
And this is a little different than the emotion fear, because that is one of the 6 big emotions.
Yep.
This is slightly different. In fact, because it's more of a fuel, and it can kind of connect to the fears and stuff like that. So Marcus Warner talks about how joy is a fuel that amplifies for us what there is in life to appreciate.
Right.
The fuel of fear amplifies all the fears or potential fears, perceived fears even, that could be in our environment.
And that's interesting because I think lots of times there are legitimate things we should be afraid of.
Absolutely.
If a bear's coming at you down the path, you want to use your bear spray or bell or whatever it is to avoid. I guess you're not supposed to run. I was going to say you better run.
Yeah.
But in the case, there are legitimate things to be afraid of. But if you're like me, my mind can go 1,000 different ways about how, and I think that's what we're talking about. When your left side of your brain gets involved and you start thinking about all the negative things that could happen, even though at the end of the day, the actual thing that's causing you to be afraid may not be as bad as what we make it out to be.
That's true.
We can blow it totally out of proportion.
That's right. Yeah, and another thing they say basically with this whole idea of the 2 different fuels is if we're not intentional about growing our joy capacity, we actually default to focusing on fear.
So that means the majority of us are running on fear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And may not completely understand that we are doing that, because it says without even realizing it, we can learn, that we are seeing that fear is maybe more important to us than joy.
So if fear is sort of our default, but joy is what was meant to be fueling our brain, then obviously it's really important then that we learn how to, or train our brains to be fueled by joy.
That's right. And we do that because truthfully that it will dominate our thoughts and kind of suck our strength and energy out. Mm-hmm. So kind of to dispel the myth that this is not just about seeing, all the pros and never seeing cons, because that's not what it's not, joy versus fear is not pro versus con, or now making sure we're always optimistic and never pessimistic. It's not that debate per se. Joy is about seeing the good, and fear is about amplifying potential and perceived dangers. That doesn't mean that joy is about being blind to some of these potential dangers. It's more about the ability to notice and process them healthily.
Okay, I think that's a really important point. Because like we said before, fear is natural, or there are legitimate things that can make us afraid. And again, when we learn to process them in a healthy way, then we're not overreacting and we can return to joy.
Yeah, because fear is really about minimizing or damage control.
Sure.
And we can start doing that before the thing really is a quote unquote problem.
Yeah.
And we're just, we see it before we do it.
Yeah.
And so when that big emotion comes, we're not processing it healthily, which is joy.
Yeah.
We're just really trying to avoid it.
Right.
And that's where we can find ourselves in responses like the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
Oh, sure. Those sound familiar. So let's go through those. So fight is what? Where we...
More of an attack.
Yeah, so we're responding in a way that... So if I'm afraid for something, I'm going to respond.
You're going to try to end that thing. So like that way. Flight is escape.
Yep, you run away.
Freeze is kind of like we stop and we're just hoping it passes us by. And fawn is more the idea of where we start to people please. So we start to...
Just do whatever it takes to make it stop.
To make it, yeah.
If that's what you really want and that's what it takes for you to stop pestering me, I'll do it.
Yeah. And so a lot of it is about avoidance.
Yeah. So you're not really dealing with any problems. You're just avoiding problems.
You're avoiding problems. That's right. And Marcus Warner talks about basically you start to fear map your world.
Yep.
Right. So when it comes to the 6 emotions, which again, we go about the idea of being fueled by joy is not about we're not having these emotions, the sadness, anger, disgust, shame, fear, hopelessness, despair. We're learning how to process these emotions, where fear is, again, looking for ways to these emotions to be avoided. And it takes a lot of emotional energy, and it really becomes that we're just avoiding these difficult emotions that come up.
Yeah, and I think because of that, our world probably gets reduced.
Yeah.
Because we actually overlook the potential joys or even the good things that are happening because we're always planning for how to avoid the fear.
That's right. So just kind of maybe an example, like if whatever emotion that we might struggle with, let's say anger, we can live a life of avoiding getting angry, and so we're, and there might be a time in our life where that might, as we're working through it, that might be okay to do for a short period of time. Because John Townsend does talk about, like, I can't remember exactly his wording for it, but like there's those boundaries you're going to keep for your life, and there's maybe temporary ones that you kind of need to do in order for healing or growth or something like that to happen. And it's sort of like, so there might be a time when you're like, okay, I'm struggling with anger. I need to avoid these kind of triggering situations, but you can't live there forever. Like
and that's
learn how to process
what we talked about in the practices where it's called, I think, soothe your senses, where you are triggered, you get angry, so you walk out of the room.
That's right.
And that's legitimate, but you still have to come back and deal with the problem eventually.
That's right.
Yeah.
The other thing too is if you struggle with emotion, it could be how to deal with people who get angry.
Yeah.
Therefore, you're just, you're again avoiding that. Avoiding people who get angry or people pleasing, so they you can mitigate that anger. So we're avoiding anything that triggers us, and again, there could be a really good legitimate reason why that's there. That we need some healing and processing through. But it really, fear is about an emotion that's for some reason we can't handle. Therefore, our real worldview becomes, how do I avoid that emotion? Yeah.
So like we've said before, of the 6 big emotions, most of us handle half of them reasonably well.
Yeah.
Some of them okay, and there's always 1 or 2 that we're triggered, we blow up, we do things we don't normally do, or that are not in line with our character.
Yeah, I find this really interesting for me though, when with one of those emotions that I don't necessarily handle as well. When I try to avoid whatever that emotion is, I usually find I end up fairly unsuccessful.
Yeah, it's just a fact of life. Yeah. No matter how much we try and mitigate or avoid, you can't avoid ever experiencing those emotions. So you're better to be ready to handle them, I think, than just trying to avoid.
That's right. So here's a couple things that they actually listed in the 4 habits of joy-filled people, just sort of what they called characteristics of a fear-ruled brain.
So see if any of you can relate to some of these.
Yeah. We scan for threats rather than the good things to enjoy. For me, I think I can almost reinterpret good things as threats.
Yeah.
When I start to do that.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying. I can do the same thing.
It'll be that whole idea of, it's like somebody gives you, say, a nice compliment, and you're like, oh, why did they say it exactly that way?
Yeah.
Because they thought this way, like, they really are hating. Build up this whole thing. So we're scanning for threats, more so than good things to enjoy. We feel guarded and avoid vulnerability. Self-preservation is the key. Now, this is important not to confuse this with healthy boundaries. But healthy boundaries are about relationships and how we can deal with emotions well. Self-preservation is about isolation.
Right. So again, I think we've all come through that in the last couple of years where, one, we were kind of forced to isolate and didn't lead to a lot of good things. But sometimes we get in the habit of that too. And again, this would say that if we are fueled by fear, that isolation is almost a natural byproduct of
Yeah, absolutely. We often give fear-based guidance rather than desire-driven wisdom. So we're, one that avoids pain while the other focuses on how to stay our relational selves. We expect worst-case scenarios and often can't even imagine a best-case scenario.
Yep.
Or we are driven by self-preservation. Thus, fear dominates our time and energy rather than joy.
Okay, so those are not good things for sure. So I can see how a lot of these would affect my relationship. So the next section is on bonding. So how does it affect our bonding?
Yeah, well, when we kind of routinely focus, reflect, or ruminate on things that bother, frighten, hurt, or annoy us, we train our brain to scan for these things. Mm-hmm. And I think when we train our brain to scan for these things, it's really easy to sort of again perceive things that I'm not going to say that you won't actually find some legitimate things. That's not the case at all. But I think we start to perceive things that are not. Not
and I think that's that comes in our relationships, like you had just mentioned before. We don't always give people the benefit of the doubt. We always go to what they must have some other misguided intention for this that is not in my best interest.
That's right. We could build up entire scenarios in our head and find out that like when we talk to the person or good conversation, confront, whatever, and say like, oh yeah, I not at all where I was going with that or anything like that. Oh, I'm really sorry that I communicated that one at all.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, that leads to isolation because it makes us want to be disconnected from others.
Yeah, and that's a big thing there. We become disconnected. And as we move into this second kind of ingredient, which is love, and we'll talk more about that starting this coming week, because we will talk about what's called insecure attachment patterns, because these attachment patterns, these insecure ones, are actually anchored in fear. Yeah. And so forth, and they do keep us essentially disconnected from others to some degree or another.
And I think it also can help us or make us feel disconnected with God. And I think that's a sort of a natural reaction for lots of people, is to be afraid of God. God's going to punish me if I don't do what he asks, or if I break the rules, or whatever I perceive that God wants me to be doing, whether it's based on actual or reality, or just things we've been taught that could be incorrect. We always have this fear that God's going to somehow strike me down or send lightning bolts, or
that's exactly
there's lots of people I know that is their only response to God.
Yeah. Well, Skye Jethani talks about different postures in his book called With, and just these are different ways in which we relate to God. And one of the postures he calls a living a life under God. And this really is about you follow the rules.
Yeah.
So instead of living a life of joy and connecting to God, you live a life of basically performing for God. Mm-hmm. And so when that thing happens, something rough in a life, so a bad thing, it's instantly, what have I done? I thought I followed all the rules. I thought I did everything right. And then, what do I need to do to make it better? What's, and why is he mad at me? And it's just all of these things that go in there. And then, that is revealing that, that there was a lot of fear bonding.
Yeah. And I think,
and as you said, it's quite normal.
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, it's too normal in how we're perceived by people who are not followers of Jesus, would say that your religion is just a bunch of rules.
That's right. John would write in 1 John 4:18-19, he would say, such love has no fear, because perfect love expels all fear. If we are afraid, it is for fear of punishment, and this shows that we have not fully experienced God's perfect love. We love each other because he loved us first.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite verses of all time, just because God's preeminent nature is love.
Yeah.
And that's something we say a lot here. And we want people to understand that, not that there isn't punishment, but that's not what God's really all about. His love is, he is about love and redemption.
Yeah. And we just, again, kind of get people prepared. If you're love is where we're going to be moving in the next kind of section when it comes to thriving community. And so we're going to talk about what we mean when we say love.
Sure.
But getting back to this, that's why it's really important in all of this that we are practicing joy and we are training our brain to bond in joy with each other, but also God.
Yeah. And that's why I think we always add the question to our joy practices is, what is God saying to us in that, either the present, the past, or the future? Yeah,
absolutely. And so, as we train our brain, we want to be able to train our brain to look back and see joy in our past. We want to be better at acknowledging it in our presence.
So being mindful,
Yeah. And then to expect it in our future.
That's good. So we expect, by anticipating joy, we expect something good to happen, which can increase our joy capacity.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks very much for joining us today on our little last little journey with joy, I guess. Oh, that sounds pretty corny. And we're just talking about the other fuel for our brain, which our default is fear. So I think this has been very helpful to me to understand why we need to have our brains fueled with joy, and that we can practice. There are practices we can do to help increase that. Now, if you've related to this today and you've realized when we looked at sort of the characteristics of a fear-fueled brain, I'll say that 10 times fast, that you relate to that. You say, that's me. I'm like that. So I would encourage you to go back and listen to our last 3 podcasts. So the first 2, we discuss the different practices, and the last one was last Sunday, where in a live stream we actually tried to practice some of these, which can be a little bit comical. And hopefully you can find that as sort of a first stepping stone to starting the joy practices yourself. So thanks again for watching. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. And we will be back next time where we start the second part of this series about attachment love.